At 3 a.m. the house feels different. Not quieter, just heavier, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. I remember staring at the red numbers on the clock, blinking slowly, hoping they would change to anything else. 3 in the morning has a way of making ordinary thoughts feel dangerous. Every memory sharpens. Every doubt grows teeth. That night I wasn't crying. I wasn't even afraid. I was wide awake in a way that felt permanent, like something inside me had finally refused to go back to sleep. I had woken up because of a sound, soft, deliberate, not loud enough to be accidental. At first, I told myself it was the house settling. Old homes make noises, people say. But this wasn't random. It was careful, measured, as if someone knew exactly how much sound they could make without being noticed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths, listening. When it happened again, closer this time, my stomach tightened in a way that felt instinctive, not imagined. I didn't move right away. Years of living alone had taught me caution, but also something else. Trusting my body when it whispers before it screams. I slid my feet onto the cold floor, the chill climbing up my legs like a warning. The hallway outside my bedroom looked normal, too normal. The faint glow from the nightlight stretched across the carpet, familiar and false in its comfort. That's when I noticed it. The door at the end of the hall wasn't fully closed. I was certain I had shut it before going to bed. Certain enough that my pulse started to race. People like to think fear announces itself loudly, but it doesn't. Fear is quiet. Convinces you to hesitate. It asks you questions you don't want to answer. I stood there, frozen, arguing with myself. Maybe I forgot. Maybe the wind. Maybe this was nothing. But another sound came from beyond that door. A soft scrape like fabric brushing against wood. And suddenly denial felt foolish. Every step toward that door felt like walking into someone else's life. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, then stopped. Light would give me visibility, yes, but it would also give me away. That thought alone told me something was very wrong. You don't worry about being seen unless you believe someone else is already there. I swallowed hard and leaned closer, my ear inches from the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard. What I heard next didn't sound like a stranger. That was the most unsettling part. It was familiar. Sigh. A pause. The faint sound of someone shifting their weight, the way people do when they're trying to be quiet. My mind scrambled, searching for logic. For an explanation that wouldn't unravel everything I thought I knew about my life, my home, my sense of safety. And that's when something inside me cracked. Not from fear, but from realization. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't random. This was personal. I stepped back, pressing my hand against my mouth to steady my breathing. Memories started surfacing without permission. Small inconsistencies I had brushed aside. Moments that felt strange but harmless at the time. The way things had been moved slightly, just enough to make me doubt myself. The way I sometimes felt watched even when I was alone. At 3 a.m., those memories lined up like evidence, and suddenly the picture they formed was impossible to ignore. I didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, I retreated silently into the bedroom and locked it, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, waiting, my thoughts spiraling faster than my breathing. Whoever was out there hadn't left. I could still hear them. Slow. Patient. As if they were waiting for something or someone. That's when the phone in my hand began to feel heavier than it ever had before. I thought about calling for help, but another thought stopped me cold. What if the truth was worse than I imagined? What if help would change everything forever? At 3 a.m., you don't just discover secrets. You meet the version of yourself that has to decide what to do with them. And as I sat there in the dark, listening to someone move through my house like they belonged there, I realized something terrifying and undeniable. Whatever was happening had been happening for a long time. I had just finally woken up. I stayed locked in my bedroom for what felt like hours, though the clock said only minutes were passing, and during that stretched, breathless time my mind replayed every moment of the past few months with a new, brutal clarity. The way you suddenly see a picture differently once someone points out the hidden figure inside it, because there had been signs, small ones, quiet ones, that I had ignored not because I was careless, but because accepting them would have meant admitting my life was not as safe or predictable as I wanted it to be. And as I sat there in the dark listening to the faint, deliberate movements outside my door, I remembered how objects in my house sometimes shifted places without explanation, How a cupboard would be slightly open when I was certain I had closed it. How once I found muddy footprints near the back door even though it hadn't rained and I had told myself they were old. Because denial is often easier than fear. Especially when fear demands action. And then there were the nights I woke up feeling watched, that strange pressure in the air that made sleep feel impossible. Nights I blamed on anxiety or bad dreams or simply getting older. But now, with someone unmistakably present in my home at 3 in the morning, those excuses collapsed under the weight of reality, and I realized that whoever was out there knew my routines, knew when I slept, knew how to move through my space without triggering immediate panic, which meant this wasn't their first time. And that thought alone made my chest tighten so hard I had to press my fist against it to keep myself from making a sound. Because fear is loud when you let it speak, and silence had become my only protection. So I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale, listening not just with my ears but with my body, trying to map the movements outside the door the way prey instinctively tracks a predator. And I noticed something even more disturbing. The footsteps never approached my bedroom, not even once, as if whoever it was already knew the door was locked, as if they were confident I wouldn't come out, and that confidence terrified me more than the noises themselves, because it suggested planning, patience, control. And then my phone buzzed in my hand, the vibration nearly sending me into panic until I saw the screen light up with a message notification, one I wasn't expecting at that hour, and as soon as I read the name my stomach dropped, because it was someone who should not have been awake. Someone who knew my house far better than any stranger ever could. Someone whose presence would explain everything I had been trying not to see. And suddenly the noises in the hallway took on a new meaning, a personal one, and I realized that calling the police wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about consequences, about exposing a truth that would shatter relationships, rewrite memories, and permanently change how I understood trust. And as I sat there staring at that message, listening to the slow, careful movements beyond my locked door, I understood that whatever happened next would divide my life into 2 parts. Everything before that night and everything after. And there would be no way to go back to the version of myself who slept peacefully, unaware, believing that the people closest to her could never be the source of her fear. I don't know how long I sat there staring at my phone, rereading that message over and over as if the words might change if I looked hard enough, but they didn't. And with every second that passed, the weight of what they implied pressed deeper into my chest, because suddenly the fear wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a history, a voice I recognized, and that made it far worse because strangers can be monsters without explanation. But when the threat comes from someone you know, someone you once trusted, it rewrites your entire understanding of safety. And as I listened to the slow movement in the hallway, I realized that whoever was out there wasn't rushing, wasn't panicking, wasn't searching blindly. They were moving with intention, as if they knew exactly where everything was, which meant they had been in my home before under normal circumstances, smiling, talking, sitting at my table, and that thought made my skin crawl, because it meant every shared moment, every laugh, every casual visit had been layered with something darker that I hadn't seen. And my mind began racing through memories, conversations that suddenly felt off, comments that once seemed harmless but now felt like warnings I ignored. And I understood then that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives politely and waits. And as my heart pounded in my ears, I debated calling the police again, my finger hovering over the screen, because dialing that number meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. It meant choosing truth over comfort, safety over silence, and I was terrified not just of what might happen if I didn't call, but of what would happen if I did, because this wasn't just about removing someone from my house. It was about unraveling a relationship, possibly destroying a family, and exposing a version of someone that others might refuse to believe. And while I hesitated, the noises stopped completely, the sudden silence louder than anything before it, because silence invites imagination. And imagination is ruthless. When fear is already in control, and I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything, until I realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, as if whoever was out there had noticed my stillness, had sensed my awareness, and that realization made my blood run cold, because it meant I was no longer an unnoticed observer hiding behind a locked door. I was part of the interaction now. And then came the sound I had been dreading most, the faint but unmistakable click of a doorknob being tested, not my bedroom door, but another one down the hall. A door that led to a room where I kept things I didn't want anyone touching, documents, memories, proof of parts of my life I wasn't ready to confront. And suddenly this wasn't just about being watched or frightened, it was about control, about invasion, about someone taking pieces of my life without permission. And I felt anger cut through the fear, sharp and unexpected, because fear makes you feel small, but anger reminds you that something has been taken from you. And in that moment I realized I didn't want to hide anymore. I wanted answers. I wanted the truth spoken out loud, even if it hurt, even if it broke something permanently. And with trembling hands, I finally pressed the call button, lifting the phone to my ear as the line rang, every ring echoing in the quiet house like a countdown. And when the operator answered, her calm voice felt surreal against the chaos in my head, and I whispered at first, afraid to be heard, explaining that someone was inside my house, that I was locked in my bedroom, that I believed I knew who it was, and saying those words out loud made everything suddenly real in a way it hadn't been before, because once spoken, truth has momentum, and there's no pulling it back. And as I stayed on the line, giving details, listening to instructions, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief, because help was on the way. But so was confrontation, and I knew that when the door finally opened, when lights flashed outside and voices filled my home, nothing would ever be the same again, not my relationships, not my memories, not even the way I understood myself, because survival isn't just about getting through the night. Sometimes it's about facing what the night reveals, and I was about to face it head-on. The sound of sirens in the distance should have brought me comfort, but instead it filled me with a new kind of fear, because once they arrived, there would be no hiding behind assumptions or half-truths anymore. Everything would be exposed under bright lights and official words. And as I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, whispering updates while my heart raced, the footsteps resumed, slower now, heavier, as if whoever was in my house knew time was running out but still felt entitled to finish whatever they had come for. And that confidence unsettled me more than panic ever could, because it suggested planning, not desperation, and I pressed myself against the bedroom door, listening as drawers opened and closed down the hall, objects shifting, the soft scrape of something being moved, and with every sound I felt pieces of my privacy being stripped away, memories violated, boundaries erased, until finally the footsteps stopped again, this time right outside my door, close enough that I could hear breathing on the other side, steady and unafraid. And in that moment I understood that this person wasn't just looking for things, they were looking for me. And the realization tightened my throat as the doorknob turned slightly, not enough to open, just enough to remind me how thin the barrier between us really was, and I froze, barely daring to breathe, while the dispatcher calmly instructed me to stay silent and assured me officers were seconds away. And those seconds stretched endlessly as the knob was released and the footsteps retreated, moving toward the front of the house just as flashing blue lights began to bleed through the curtains, casting long shadows across the walls. And when the knock came, loud and authoritative, announcing police presence, it shattered the tension like glass, and suddenly voices filled the house, firm and controlled, commanding whoever was inside to show themselves. And I unlocked my door with shaking hands, stepping into the hallway as officers moved past me, weapons drawn, scanning every corner with practiced precision. And I felt both small and strangely invisible as they took control of the space I had been trapped in moments before. And then I saw him, standing near the living room, hands raised, his face caught between shock and irritation, not fear, not guilt but annoyance, as if this interruption was an inconvenience rather than the consequence of his actions, and that expression hurt more than anything else because it confirmed what I had been avoiding for so long, that whatever had brought him into my house tonight, it wasn't an accident or misunderstanding, it was a choice. And as the officers questioned him, his story shifted, first claiming he was checking on me, then saying he thought the house was empty, then finally falling silent when confronted with the evidence of forced entry. And I watched this unraveling with a numb clarity, noticing details I never had before, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his jaw tightened when my name was spoken, the way he looked at me not with concern but with calculation. And in that moment I felt a deep grief settle in, not just for the fear of the night, but for the version of him I had believed in, the one who would never hurt me, the one I had defended in my mind against small doubts for years. And as he was escorted out, still trying to explain, still trying to control the narrative, I realized that this was never just about one night or one choice. It was about a pattern I had ignored, a discomfort I had learned to minimize. And when the door closed behind him and the house fell quiet again, the silence felt different, heavier but cleaner, like air after a storm. And an officer gently asked if I was okay, if there was anything else I wanted to report, and I hesitated, because this was the moment where I could tell the full truth, not just about tonight, but about the other moments, the uneasy feelings, The boundaries crossed that I had brushed aside, and my voice shook as I spoke, but I spoke anyway because survival isn't just about escaping danger, it's about reclaiming your voice. And as they took notes and really listened, I felt something shift inside me, a fragile but growing sense of strength, because even though the night had taken something from me, my sense of safety, my trust, it had also given me something I didn't expect, clarity. And as the officers finally left, advising me on next steps and safety measures, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by familiar objects that now felt altered. And I understood that healing wouldn't come quickly or easily, but it would come, because I had faced the truth instead of running from it, and that choice, as terrifying as it was, had changed everything. The days after that night blurred together in a strange mix of exhaustion and heightened awareness, where every creak of the house made my heart jump and every quiet moment felt too loud, as if my mind refused to return to the calm I once took for granted. And even though the locks had been changed and the police had reassured me repeatedly that he would not be coming back, the sense of violation lingered, clinging to the walls, the furniture, even the air itself, and I began noticing things I had overlooked for years, subtle patterns that now seemed obvious in hindsight, like how he always knew my schedule too well, how he dismissed my discomfort as overthinking, how I had learned to doubt my own instincts because it was easier than confronting what they were trying to tell me. And as I moved through the house, room by room, cleaning up the physical mess left behind, I found myself uncovering emotional debris as well, memories resurfacing with sharp clarity, moments that once felt insignificant now heavy with meaning. And one afternoon, while sorting through a drawer he had rifled through, I found something that stopped me cold, a folded piece of paper tucked beneath old mail, containing notes written in his handwriting, dates, times, observations about me, my habits, my movements, and my stomach twisted as I realized this wasn't recent. It had been going on far longer than I wanted to admit, and the fear I felt that night transformed into something deeper and more unsettling. A betrayal that cut into the foundation of trust one had built my life on, and as I sat there on the floor, holding those pages, I felt a mix of anger and grief, mourning not just the safety I lost, but the version of myself who had believed so fiercely in the goodness of others. And when I brought the notes to the police, their expressions changed instantly, the calm professionalism replaced with concern, and they explained gently that this shifted things, that it suggested premeditation, a level of fixation that couldn't be ignored, and hearing those words spoken out loud made everything feel painfully real, because it meant the danger hadn't been random, it had been personal. And as the investigation deepened, more truths surfaced. Neighbors mentioned seeing him around the house at odd hours, friends recalled comments that once seemed harmless but now sounded unsettling, and with every new piece of information, the story I had told myself for years unraveled further, leaving behind a stark reality I could no longer soften. And yet, amid all this, something unexpected began to happen inside me. A quiet resolve started to take shape because once the illusion shattered, I no longer felt the need to protect it, and I started making choices I had delayed for too long, setting boundaries, asking for help, speaking openly about what had happened instead of minimizing it to keep others comfortable. And the more I spoke, the lighter I felt, as if truth itself was a kind of release. And one evening, as I sat with a close friend who listened without interruption, without judgment, I realized how long I had carried this weight alone, believing strength meant silence, when in reality, strength was allowing myself to be seen. And though fear still crept in at night, it no longer controlled me the way it once did, because now fear had context, a beginning, a name, and that made it something I could face. And when the legal process moved forward, slow and frustrating as it was, I committed to seeing it through, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect, because walking away without acknowledging the harm would mean leaving parts of myself behind. And as weeks passed, the house began to feel like mine again, not because the memories faded, but because I was reclaiming the space with intention, rearranging furniture, repainting walls, opening windows, letting light and air replace the heaviness that had settled in. And one morning, standing in the kitchen with sunlight pouring in, I caught my reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman staring back at me, not because she looked different, but because there was a steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence born not from innocence, but from survival. And I understood then that healing wasn't about returning to who I was before, it was about becoming someone new, someone who trusted herself even when it was uncomfortable, someone who listened to the warnings instead of explaining them away. And while the story was far from over, I no longer felt like a passive character trapped inside it, because for the first time, I was choosing how it would continue. And that choice, fragile and powerful all at once, marked the true turning point of everything. By the time the legal process truly began, I had already learned that justice does not arrive with drama or certainty, but with paperwork, waiting rooms, and long stretches of silence that test your resolve. And sitting in that courtroom for the first time, I felt smaller than I ever had, surrounded by strangers who knew fragments of my life reduced to statements and evidence, while I carried the full weight of every night I'd lain awake wondering how close I'd come to losing everything. And when he walked in, avoiding my eyes, looking nothing like the looming figure from my nightmares, it startled me how ordinary he appeared, because it forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth, that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like people we once trusted, people we defended, people we made excuses for. And as the proceedings unfolded, I listened as details of my own life were recited back to me by others. Facts stripped of emotion, moments dissected and examined, and there were times I wanted to stand up and scream that this wasn't just a case, it was my home, my safety, my sense of self that had been violated. But instead I sat there, hands folded tightly, breathing through the discomfort, reminding myself why I was there. And when it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled at first, not from fear of him, but from the gravity of finally telling the truth without softening it, without protecting anyone else's comfort. And as I spoke, something shifted, because each word I said felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost along the way. And I could see it in the room, the way people leaned in, the way the narrative changed from suspicion to understanding. And although the process was slow, painfully so, there was power and persistence in showing up again and again even when exhaustion begged me to quit. And outside the courtroom, life continued in strange, disjointed ways. Errands still needed running, bills still needed paying, and I found myself navigating a dual reality, one where I was fighting for accountability, and another where I was relearning how to live without constant vigilance. And there were setbacks too, moments when doubt crept in, when legal delays made me question whether the effort was worth it. But each time I felt myself wavering, I remembered the notes, the hidden surveillance, the calculated nature of it all. And I knew that walking away would mean accepting a version of reality that wasn't true. And then came the day everything changed, not with a verdict, but with testimony I hadn't expected, a statement from someone who had seen him before I ever questioned him. Someone who confirmed patterns I'd sensed but couldn't prove. And as those words echoed through the courtroom, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, relief that I hadn't imagined it, sorrow that it had been real all along. And for the first time since this began, I felt the balance shift, the power no longer resting solely in his silence or my fear, but in truth laid bare. And afterward, as I stepped outside into the daylight, the air felt different, lighter somehow, and though the outcome was still uncertain, I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to heal, because healing had already begun in the act of standing my ground. And that night, alone in my home, I allowed myself to feel everything I had postponed, the anger, the grief, the betrayal, but also the pride, because surviving wasn't just about enduring the worst moments. It was about choosing yourself even when the path forward is unclear. And as weeks passed, I started noticing changes not just around me, but within me, the way I walked with more confidence, the way I no longer apologized for taking up space, the way I trusted my instincts instead of questioning them. And when people asked how I was holding up, I stopped giving polite answers and started telling the truth, because honesty had become my anchor. And though the final resolution was still ahead, I understood something vital, that justice isn't only about consequences handed down by a court, it's also about reclaiming your narrative, refusing to be defined by what was done to you. And as I prepared myself for whatever outcome lay ahead, I felt steadier than ever, because no matter what happened next, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would never again silence myself to make someone else more comfortable. And that realization, more than any ruling, marked the moment I truly took my life back. The day of the final hearing arrived quietly, almost deceptively so, without the dramatic buildup I had imagined during countless sleepless nights. And as I sat there waiting for my name to be called, I realized how much had changed inside me since this journey began. Because fear was no longer the loudest voice in my head, clarity was. And when I looked across the room and saw him again, I didn't feel the familiar tightening in my chest. Instead, there was a calm distance, the kind that comes when someone no longer has power over your sense of worth. And as statements were read and arguments concluded, I listened not as a victim hoping to be believed, but as a woman who had already reclaimed her truth. And when it was finally over, When the judge's words settled into the air and the room emptied out, I felt neither triumph nor devastation, just a deep, grounding stillness. Because justice rarely looks like vindication, it looks like closure, and outside the courthouse, standing on the steps where so many emotions had passed through me before, I understood that this chapter of my life was ending whether or not the outcome matched my expectations, and that realization was oddly freeing, because it meant my healing was no longer tied to someone else's actions, and in the days that followed, I found myself revisiting memories I had long avoided, not to relive them, but to finally place them where they belonged in the past, and I began making small changes that felt monumental, rearranging my home, donating things that carried heavy associations, reclaiming spaces that had once felt unsafe, and with each small act, I felt myself stepping further into a future I was choosing intentionally, and people noticed too, the way my voice no longer wavered when I spoke, the way I set boundaries without apology, and though not everyone understood my decisions, I learned that understanding was not a requirement for self-respect. And then unexpectedly, I received a message from him, brief and carefully worded, attempting closure on his terms, but as I read it, I felt nothing but certainty because I no longer needed explanations that came too late, and I didn't respond not out of spite but out of peace, because some conversations serve only to reopen wounds that have finally begun to heal, and instead, I turned my attention to rebuilding connections that mattered, relationships rooted in honesty and mutual respect. And as weeks turned into months, I noticed something profound. The absence of fear created space for joy, quiet joy at first. Then more confident moments of laughter, curiosity, and hope, and while the scars remained, they no longer defined the landscape of my life, they were reminders of strength rather than symbols of pain. And one evening, as I sat alone reflecting on everything that had brought me here, I realized that survival had been only the first step. Living fully required something more: courage, the courage to trust myself again, to believe in my own resilience, and to let go of the version of me that stayed silent to keep the peace. And as I embraced that truth, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for what happened, but for who I had become because I refused to let it break me. And though the road ahead was still unwritten, I faced it with confidence, knowing that no matter what challenges came next, I had already proven to myself that I could endure, evolve, and emerge stronger than before. And as this chapter closed, I stood firmly in the knowledge that my story was no longer about what was done to me, it was about what I chose to do next. As I stand here now, telling this story not from a place of pain but from a place of understanding, I realize that the most powerful transformation didn't happen in courtrooms, conversations, or confrontations. It happened quietly within me, in the moments when I chose not to shrink myself anymore. Because for so long I believed survival meant endurance, staying silent, staying small, convincing myself that tolerance was strength. But the truth is, strength looks very different when you finally recognize your own worth. And in the months after everything settled, I stopped waiting for life to feel normal again and started redefining what normal meant for me. A life where peace mattered more than appearances, where my voice mattered even if it made others uncomfortable, and where I no longer measured my value by how much I could endure for others. And slowly, intentionally, I began building a future that reflected those values. I reconnected with dreams I had once dismissed as unrealistic, explored interests I had put aside to keep others comfortable, and surrounded myself with people who didn't question my boundaries or minimize my experiences. And with each choice, I felt a deeper sense of alignment, like I was finally living in truth rather than reaction. And one afternoon, while organizing old documents and photos, I came across images from years ago, moments that once filled me with sadness, but this time I felt something else entirely: compassion for the woman I had been, the one who stayed, hoped, endured, and tried to make things work even when the cost was herself. And instead of judging her, I thanked her, because without her strength, I wouldn't be standing where I am now. And that realization shifted something profound inside me, because healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about honoring it without letting it control you. And as word of my journey quietly reached others, people I barely knew began opening up, sharing their own stories of silence, fear, and survival. And I understood then that my story was never meant to be carried alone. It was meant to be shared, not for sympathy, but for connection, because when one person speaks their truth, it gives others permission to do the same. And that responsibility humbled me deeply, because it reminded me that pain, when processed honestly, can become purpose. And while I don't claim to have all the answers, I know this much with certainty: choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. And letting go of people who diminish your spirit does not make you heartless, it makes you whole. And today my life looks quieter on the surface, but it is richer in every way that matters. My laughter comes easily, my sleep is deeper. My decisions are guided by clarity rather than fear. And when I look ahead, I no longer see uncertainty as a threat, I see it as possibility because I trust myself now. And if you're listening to this and seeing pieces of your own life reflected here, I want you to know that it's never too late to rewrite your story. No matter how trapped you feel, no matter how long you've stayed silent, your voice still matters, your boundaries are valid, and your future does not have to look like your past. And maybe your strength hasn't shown itself yet. Not because it doesn't exist, but because you've been using it to survive instead of to live. And when the time comes when you're ready, you'll know, because something inside you will shift just like it did for me. And you'll stop asking for permission to be at peace and start claiming it. And if my story leaves you with anything, let it be this: you are allowed to choose yourself even if no one else understands, because in the end, the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. And once you protect that, truly protect it, nothing can take your power away again.